In the spring of 1912, a young archaeologist named Llewellyn Loud stepped off a train in Nevada and made his way toward a low limestone cave rising above a dry lake bed near the town of Lovelock. He had been sent by the University of California to examine a site that guano miners had already been digging through for almost a year. What he found waiting for him inside that cave would occupy his attention and the attention of researchers who came after him for more than a century. Why had a company mining bat droppings for fertilizer stumbled onto one of the richest archaeological deposits in the American West? Why had the people who lived closest to that cave already been telling a very specific story about it, decades before any scientist arrived? Why did that story describe a battle, a fire, and a group of people the Paiute called the Si-Te-Cah? And why, long before anyone had reason to connect legend with layers of ancient guano, had a local mining engineer already been led to that exact cave and told in plain terms that the story was real? The cave itself sits in a landscape that does not look, at first glance, like a place that could hold thousands of years of continuous human history. Western Nevada's Pershing County is dry, sun-bleached and quiet, part of what was once the floor of an enormous prehistoric body of water known to geologists as Lake Lahontan. As that ancient lake receded over thousands of years, it left behind a scattering of caves, rock shelters, and dry lake beds, many of which would later prove to hold remarkably well-preserved organic material, protected from decay by the region's arid climate. Lovelock Cave, sometimes also called Sunset Guano Cave, Horseshoe Cave, or simply Indian Cave in older records, was one of those shelters. It is not a large or dramatic feature on the landscape. It does not announce itself the way a canyon or a mountain might, and that, in part, is why it went untouched by serious archaeological interest for as long as it did. Long before Loud or the guano miners ever approached the cave, a mining engineer named John T. Reed had already stood at its entrance. In 1886, while prospecting in the area, Reed was reportedly told of a local legend by Paiute residents living near Lovelock. According to his own later account, the story struck him enough that he asked to see the place it described, and members of the community took him to the cave itself, insisting that the tale attached to it was not simply a story, but something that had actually happened there. Reed had no means, and apparently no strong inclination to excavate the site himself. He noted the cave, noted the story, and moved on. For 25 years, nothing more happened. The legend remained a legend, carried forward the way oral traditions usually are, spoken rather than published, known locally rather than nationally. It would take a mining operation with no interest in history at all to finally bring that cave back into view. The outsiders who first came to Lovelock Cave were not looking for history, they were looking for profit. Guano, the accumulated droppings of generations of bats, was a valuable source of nitrogen for fertilizer companies on the west coast, and a mining company run by David Pugh and James Hart began removing it from the cave in 1911. Their crews shipped more than 250 tons of material to San Francisco that year alone. They were not archaeologists, they were not looking for artifacts, and by most accounts, whatever they found in those early months that did not resemble guano was simply discarded, sold, or lost. But guano does not stay undisturbed for thousands of years without covering something else. As the miners worked deeper into the cave floor, they began turning up objects that had no place in a fertilizer operation: woven baskets, sandals built from plant fiber, tools shaped from stone and bone, and according to several later accounts, human remains. Word of the discoveries eventually reached local authorities and, from there, the University of California. That is what brought Llewellyn Loud to the cave in the spring of 1912. What Loud found once formal excavation began was staggering in scale, even if his own records of it were, by later standards, incomplete. Over the course of his work, he recovered close to 10,000 individual specimens, woven duck decoys built from real duck skin and feathers, so well preserved that they still resembled living birds, sandals nearly 15 inches long, nets, cordage, and baskets, some estimated to be well over 2,000 years old. Loud returned to the site again in 1924, this time working alongside another archaeologist, Mark Raymond Harrington, and the two of them recovered even more material, including a cache of 11 of those duck decoys found together in a single location. The scale of what came out of that cave was not in question. Historians and archaeologists agree that Lovelock Cave preserved one of the most significant collections of ancient artifacts ever recovered in the Great Basin region. Loud's own methods, judged against later archaeological standards, were far from careful. Working quickly and with limited funding, he moved through layers of deposit that a modern excavation would take years to document, and his final report devoted only a short paragraph of description to finds that, today, would occupy entire volumes. Even so, what survived that hurried process was extraordinary. Basketry technique that had barely changed across centuries, tools shaped for specific, repeated tasks, and organic material so well preserved by the dry cave environment that researchers could still identify individual plant fibers used in construction nearly 2,000 years after they were woven. When Loud returned in 1924, alongside Mark Raymond Harrington, the two men were not the only ones drawn back to the area that year. A separate excavation nearby, connected to a man named Fenley Hunter, produced a report that would circulate for years afterward. According to an article published in the Nevada Review Minor in 1931, two unusually large skeletons had been recovered from a dry lake bed close to Lovelock, one measuring roughly 6.5 feet and the other reportedly exceeding 8 feet in length, both said to have been preserved through a mummification process the article compared to methods used in ancient Egypt. That article, and others like it circulating in regional newspapers during the 1920s and 1930s, is where the modern image of the Lovelock giants largely takes shape. It is also where caution becomes most necessary. No physical remains matching those exact measurements have survived for modern examination, and later researchers who reviewed available skeletal material from the broader Lovelock excavations found human remains consistent with ordinary human variation, generally under 6.5 feet, rather than anything approaching the extreme figures printed in 1931. Some objects once displayed publicly as evidence of giant remains have, on closer inspection by later scientists, turned out not to be human at all. What can be said is that period newspapers amplified an already dramatic discovery into something more extraordinary still, and that amplification, once printed, proved difficult to walk back. What remained less certain was whether any part of that amplified account still reflected something true about the people the Paiute themselves had already been describing for a generation before the miners ever arrived. Some of the human remains recovered from the cave were described in period sources as unusually large, and some of those same remains were said to show traces of reddish hair. Neither of those details can be treated as settled fact. That distinction matters, and it is worth being precise about it. Contemporary newspaper reports from the era around the Lovelock excavations describe skeletons reaching heights well beyond 6 feet, with some accounts difficult to verify against surviving physical evidence, describing remains closer to 8 or even 10 feet in length. Modern researchers who have reviewed the surviving skeletal material argue that these figures were almost certainly exaggerated, whether through the excitement of discovery, the commercial interests of local promoters eager to attract visitors, or simple error in a period before rigorous forensic measurement was standard practice. As for the reported red hair, some scientists suggest that pigment in human hair can shift toward a reddish or rust tone after long burial, depending on soil chemistry, moisture, and temperature, regardless of what color that hair may have been in life. Whether either detail reflects something unusual about the people actually buried in that cave, or reflects the ordinary distortions that gather around any dramatic discovery, remains a subject of debate among researchers, and it may never be fully resolved. What is far less contested is that a story about very similar figures already existed among the Northern Paiute long before any guano miner ever set foot in that cave. In 1883, a Paiute writer and lecturer named Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins published a book titled Life Among the Paiutes. Winnemucca was by that point already a well-known public figure, the daughter of a respected Paiute leader and one of the earliest Native American women to publish a book-length account of her own community's history in English. Her purpose in writing was not to record folklore for its own sake, She was documenting Paiute life, land and treatment at the hands of the United States government, and the story of the Si-Te-Cah appears within that larger, more urgent account as a piece of inherited tribal history, not as an isolated tale invented for effect. That context matters. Winnemucca had every reason to write carefully and every reason to expect scrutiny, and the tradition she recorded had, by her own account, already been passed down through generations before she ever set it in print. According to that account, a group of people known as the Si-Te-Cah, described as tall, fair-skinned and red-haired, had once lived in the region. They were remembered as violent, difficult to live alongside, and eventually the target of a long, exhausting conflict between the Paiute and several neighboring peoples. That distinction, too, deserves care. The word Si-Te-Cah itself in the Northern Paiute language is generally translated as something closer to tule eaters, a reference to the reed plants that grow along the shores of nearby lakes, rather than as a direct word for giants. The idea that the Si-Te-Cah were physically enormous appears to be a detail that grew heavier over time, shaped by retellings, by outside interest, and by later writers eager to connect the story to broader, more sensational claims about lost races. What the oral tradition consistently preserves, regardless of stature, is conflict, exile, and a specific, named place where that conflict reached its end. According to the tradition recorded by Winnemucca and by later ethnographers who spoke with Paiute elders, the conflict with the Si-Te-Cah did not end quietly. The story holds that after years of raids and losses on both sides, the Paiute and their allies finally cornered the remaining Si-Te-Cah inside a cave near what is now Lovelock. When the group inside refused to come out and fight, their pursuers are said to have filled the entrance with brush and set it burning, hoping to force a surrender. Some who emerged were killed as they came through the smoke. Others, according to the account, remained inside and did not come out at all. It is worth pausing on how strange that detail becomes once it is placed next to what archaeologists actually found nearly 3 decades later. A cave near Lovelock, containing extensive human remains and thousands of artifacts, some showing evidence of burning. A story already told to outsiders as early as 1886, when a mining engineer named John T. Reed was reportedly taken to the site by local Paiute residents who insisted the tale was true and the cave was real. None of that proves the oral tradition describes the exact individuals whose remains Loud eventually recovered. Oral traditions are not transcripts. They are carried forward through generations of retelling, shaped by memory, by meaning, and by the needs of each generation that keeps a story alive. But the fact that a specific cave, a specific method of confrontation involving fire, and a specific outcome were already associated with this location before any formal excavation took place is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Should the size and hair color recorded in some Lovelock accounts be read as an exaggerated echo of an older physical difference between two groups who once shared this land? Could the story of the Si-Te-Cah preserve, in a much more modest form, a real historical conflict between distinct communities, later reshaped into a more dramatic account as it passed between generations? Or does the alignment between story and site simply reflect how often human beings return to caves year after year for entirely unrelated reasons until legend and archaeology eventually appear to intersect by chance? Historians who study oral tradition caution against treating any one of these explanations as final. What can be said with more confidence is that Lovelock Cave itself was inhabited across an extraordinary span of time. Researchers estimate that people used the site for roughly 4,000 years, with the most intensive period of occupation falling somewhere between 1,500 years before the Common Era and the early centuries after it, a period archaeologists sometimes refer to as the Lovelock culture. The Paiute themselves apparently distinguish between the earlier occupants of the cave, whom they called the Si-Te-Cah, and the specific group remembered as the Si-Te-Cah, suggesting that even within Paiute tradition, the history of that single cave was understood as layered, populated by more than one group across a very long stretch of time. That layering is in its own way exactly what the archaeological record shows as well. artifact after artifact, generation after generation, compressed into the same guano-covered floor that the miners of 1911 broke open without knowing what lay beneath. Lovelock Cave is not, historians studying Great Basin oral tradition point out, an entirely isolated case either. Similar accounts describing a distinct, often taller or lighter featured people, later driven out or destroyed after conflict with local communities, appear in the oral histories of other Great Basin and Great Plains peoples as well, sometimes tied to specific caves, sometimes to specific lakes or valleys. Researchers who study these parallel traditions caution against treating them as evidence of a single, continent-spanning lost race, an idea that some writers outside the historical and archaeological professions have used the Si-Te-Cah story to support, generally without rigorous evidence. It is equally possible, these researchers argue, that stories describing conflict between distinct, competing groups occurring at cave sites or along ancient shorelines are simply a recurring narrative pattern, one that different communities across the Great Basin developed independently to explain their own local landscape and their own local history of displacement, migration, and survival. Whether the Si-Te-Cah tradition is one thread within that broader pattern, or something more specific to the Lovelock area alone, remains an open question, and one that oral historians continue to study alongside archaeologists rather than in isolation from them. It is tempting, faced with a story this vivid, to reach for the simplest possible answer, to declare the Si-Te-Cah either entirely fictional or entirely literal. Neither position sits comfortably with the evidence as it currently stands. The mummified remains that once fueled claims of giant skeletons have, in more recent examination, largely failed to support those specific claims, and some remains once displayed as evidence of the Si-Te-Cah have since been identified as belonging to entirely different species, including cattle. At the same time, dismissing the entire tradition as invented folklore ignores the specificity with which it was recorded, the consistency with which it was told to outsiders across multiple decades, and the genuine, undeniable presence of extensive human burial and habitation within that exact cave. Somewhere between outright myth and literal history lies a version of this story that historians are still working to understand. Perhaps that uncertainty is the real subject of this account, more than the Si-Te-Cah themselves. A guano mining operation, begun for entirely commercial reasons in 1911, tore open a site that preserved thousands of years of human presence, alongside a story that Paiute families had already been telling for at least a generation before any archaeologist arrived to listen. The written record and the spoken tradition do not perfectly agree, and they were never going to. One measures artifacts, radiocarbon dates, and burial patterns. The other carries memory, meaning, and warning across generations by voice rather than by instrument. Lovelock Cave sits at the point where both kinds of evidence meet, neither one fully confirming nor fully denying the other, both pointing toward a specific place and a specific, still unresolved question about who once lived, fought, and died within its walls. History, more often than people expect, does not arrive as a finished account. It arrives in fragments, a guano deposit disturbed for profit, a shipment of 250 tons sent to a fertilizer company, a young archaeologist's incomplete field notes, a newspaper article from 1931 that stretched a real discovery into something larger than the evidence could support, and a story an elder chose to pass down long before anyone thought to write it into a government report. Each fragment on its own explains very little. Together they outline the edges of something that historians and archaeologists continue to circle, more than a century after that first shipment of guano left the Nevada desert. Somewhere between an exaggerated newspaper headline and a dismissed piece of folklore, there may be a far quieter, far more human story still waiting to be understood, one involving real people, a real cave, and a real conflict remembered long after its original details had already begun to change in the telling. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through archaeology, Indigenous oral tradition, and the historical record, consider subscribing for more investigations like this one. And before you go, I would like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Si-Te-Cah, whatever their true stature or origin, were remembered because something specific and historical actually happened at that cave? Or do you think the story grew, generation by generation, into something larger than the events that first inspired it? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.